"Sir, please listen. Someone upstairs is about to die." The words barely left his lips before the force of dismissal hit him. Not a strike, not a blow, just a firm, practiced shove meant to erase him from the room. And Elijah Cross stumbled back a single step, his worn sneakers scraping against the polished marble floor of St. Augustine Medical Center, the kind of floor so clean it reflected the overhead lights like a frozen lake. The kind of place where everything looked perfect as long as you didn't look too closely. And for a moment, no one spoke. Because something about the contrast, the man in a frayed coat, rainwater still clinging to the edges of his sleeves, standing beneath a chandelier worth more than most people's homes, made the air tighten just enough to notice, but not enough for anyone to act. And Brian Whitaker adjusted his cuff like nothing had happened, his voice smooth, controlled, carrying just enough authority to make silence feel like obedience as he said, "You can't be in here." Not loud, not angry, just final, like a door closing somewhere deep inside a building no one else could access. And Elijah didn't look at him. Not immediately, his gaze drifting past the manager's shoulder, past the front desk, past the waiting room, where people sat scrolling on their phones or staring at the muted TV mounted on the wall, his eyes lifting instead toward the second-floor balcony, where a faint flicker of movement caught the corner of his vision. Something subtle, something wrong, like a rhythm out of place in a room, designed for control, and his breath steadied, not panicked, not rushed, just measured, as if he had already made a decision long before he walked through those glass doors. And when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but anchored. "There's a patient upstairs. Room 214. He's not being monitored correctly." And a few heads turned this time, not out of concern but curiosity, the kind that comes when someone breaks the invisible script everyone else follows. And Brian's expression didn't change, not at first. But there was a flicker there, something small, something almost imperceptible, like a shadow passing over glass. And then it was gone, replaced by the same polished composure that had built his career. "Security's on the way," he said, already turning slightly as if the conversation had ended before it began. And that was when the silence stretched, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy enough to feel, because Elijah didn't move, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides, as if the weight of the moment belonged to someone else entirely. And outside, beyond the tall glass entrance, the sky had begun to shift, clouds gathering low and thick, pressing down on the city in a way that made the light inside the lobby feel sharper, colder, more artificial. And a single drop of rain traced its way down the glass, slow and deliberate, followed by another, and another, until the world outside blurred into streaks of gray. And still, Elijah's eyes remained fixed upward, not on the people around him, not on the manager dismissing him, but on something unseen, something only he seemed to recognize. And his voice, when it came again, didn't carry urgency in the way people expected. It carried certainty. "If no one checks on him now, you won't have time later." And that was when a murmur rippled through the room, soft, uncertain, like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. And Brian exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signaled patience wearing thin, his posture tightening just enough to reclaim control of the space. "You need to leave," he said, firmer this time. And still, Elijah didn't look at him. Not yet, because something else had already begun to shift, subtle, almost invisible, like a crack forming beneath the surface of something that had always appeared unbreakable. And somewhere above them, beyond the polished floors and controlled voices and curated calm, a monitor flickered, just once, unnoticed, unheard, except by the one man everyone was trying not to see. The first sound was not an alarm, but a hesitation. A nurse at the far end of the second-floor hallway pausing mid-step as she glanced at a monitor that did not behave the way it should, a single line stuttering where rhythm should have been steady. And she frowned, not yet alarmed, just uncertain, like someone trying to remember if they had forgotten something small but important. And downstairs the lobby held its breath in a different way, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing had, because Elijah Cross still stood there exactly where he had been told not to stand, his coat damp at the edges, the faint scent of rain trailing in with him as the automatic doors slid open and closed behind arriving visitors who never quite looked directly at him. And Brian Whitaker checked his watch as if time itself could reinforce his authority, his jaw set in that careful balance between professionalism and impatience, and two security guards approached from the hallway, their steps measured, not aggressive, just procedural, the kind of movement designed to resolve a situation without creating one. And Elijah finally shifted his gaze, not toward them, not toward Brian, but toward the front desk where a young receptionist hesitated with her hand hovering over the phone, unsure whether to call upstairs or wait for instruction. And Elijah took a slow breath, the kind that carried memory with it, the kind that belonged to someone who had stood in rooms like this before, but under very different circumstances. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost reflective. He should not be alone right now. And the words did not rise above the ambient noise of the lobby, but they landed somewhere deeper, somewhere that made the receptionist's fingers twitch slightly above the keypad, and Brian noticed the shift even if he did not understand it. And he stepped forward just enough to reassert control, not touching, not raising his voice, just placing himself between Elijah and the rest of the room like a barrier that did not need to announce itself. "Sir, you are not authorized to give medical input here," he said, each word precise, rehearsed, built from years of maintaining order in a place that thrived on hierarchy. And Elijah's eyes moved to him then, finally, calm and steady, not defiant, not submissive, just present. And for a fraction of a second something unsettled Brian, not fear, not recognition, just a feeling that the man in front of him did not fit the role he had already assigned. And upstairs the nurse took another step toward room 214, her pace quickening now, not because of instruction, but because of instinct, and she pushed the door open just slightly, enough to see the patient resting under dimmed lights, machines surrounding him in quiet vigilance. Except one was no longer quiet. One emitted a faint, irregular tone that did not match the others, and her hand moved to the call button but paused, just for a second, because she thought she could correct it herself. And back in the lobby, the security guards reached Elijah, one of them speaking in a calm, practiced tone. "Sir, we are going to have to ask you to step outside." And Elijah nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had expected this part of the sequence, and he took a single step back, his shoes leaving a faint trace of moisture on the polished floor that quickly disappeared under the overhead light. And the rain outside grew steadier now, tapping softly against the glass like a quiet insistence, and Elijah glanced once more toward the upper level, not with urgency, but with something deeper, something that carried the weight of knowing exactly how little time certain things require to change. And his voice came one last time, low and even. "Check the oxygen saturation," and the words slipped into the space between movements, between decisions, between assumptions, and for a moment no one responded, not Brian, not the guards, not the people watching from a distance, but the receptionist did, almost without realizing it, her hand finally pressing the call button as she spoke into the phone upstairs, her voice uncertain but clear. "Can someone take another look at room 214? And the line clicked. And above them the nurse froze as she heard the request echo through her earpiece at the exact moment her eyes returned to the monitor, and this time she did not hesitate. Upstairs the nurse did not call for help right away this time. She moved faster than thought, her hand adjusting the oxygen line, her eyes scanning the monitor as the numbers flickered just outside their normal range. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, but wrong in a way that felt quiet and dangerous, like a whisper in a room meant for silence. And she pressed the alert button, now not hesitating, not second-guessing, and within seconds another nurse stepped in, followed by a resident doctor who had been reviewing charts down the hall, their voices low, controlled, focused on correction, not panic, because in places like this panic was the one thing that could spread faster than any condition. And downstairs the echo of that decision had not yet reached the lobby, but something had already begun to shift in the air, something subtle, something unspoken, because the receptionist lowered the phone slowly, her eyes drifting toward Elijah again, as if trying to reconcile what she had just done with why she had done it. And Brian Whitaker noticed that look. He noticed the way attention was no longer fully his, and that was enough to tighten something in his chest, not fear, not yet, but a resistance to losing control over a situation that had already gone on longer than it should have. And he stepped closer again, his voice quieter this time, but edged with finality. "That is enough," he said to the guards, not raising his tone, but sharpening it just enough to cut through hesitation. and the guards nodded, one reaching out slightly, gesturing toward the door. "Sir, we need you to come with us now." And Elijah looked at the hand, not with offense, not with reluctance, just with a kind of distant understanding, as if this moment was simply another step in a sequence he had already accepted, and he moved one step forward toward the entrance, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft mechanical sigh, letting in the steady rhythm of rain and cool air. And for a brief second, the outside world seemed louder than everything inside, the patter of rain against concrete, the distant hum of passing traffic, the kind of ordinary noise that made the silence inside the hospital feel even more artificial and controlled. And Elijah paused right at the threshold, not resisting, not lingering, just stopping long enough to turn his head slightly back toward the lobby, toward the ceiling, toward something beyond immediate sight. And he spoke again, not louder, not urgent, just certain. "If the alarm sounds in the next minute, do not wait for protocol." And one of the guards frowned slightly, not understanding, but the words settled anyway, somewhere beneath logic, beneath training. And Brian exhaled sharply, now the patience gone, replaced by a quiet irritation that had nothing to do with Elijah himself and everything to do with the disruption of order. "Take him outside," he said, and this time there was no softness in it, just command, clean and simple. And the guards guided Elijah forward one step into the rain, where droplets immediately darkened the fabric of his coat, blending with what was already there, and the doors closed behind him, sealing the lobby back into its curated calm. But it did not feel the same anymore, not to the receptionist, not to the guard who had hesitated, not even to Brian, who now adjusted his jacket again, as if resetting the scene back into place. And then it happened. Not loud, not dramatic, just a single tone cutting through the air from somewhere above, a monitor alarm, sharp and precise, followed by another, and then a sequence that no one in that building could ignore, because it meant something had crossed from manageable into urgent. And the receptionist's head snapped upward, her eyes widening just slightly as she looked toward the second floor, and Brian froze, not visibly, not in a way anyone would call out, but internally something paused, something recalculated, because the timing was wrong, too exact, too immediate. And upstairs, the resident doctor's voice rose just enough to carry authority. "Call respiratory now." And the nurse moved instantly, her hands steady, her focus locked, as the numbers on the monitor began to stabilize, not by chance, not by luck, but because someone had intervened before the situation could escalate further. And back at the entrance, the rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent, as Elijah stood just beyond the glass, his figure slightly blurred by the streaks of water, his posture unchanged, his gaze no longer fixed upward but forward, as if he had already done what he came to do and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The sound did not stay contained to the second floor for long. It traveled through the structure in a way only trained ears could fully interpret, a pattern of alerts, not chaotic, but layered, signaling escalation and response. And in the lobby, conversations stopped, not all at once, but in fragments, as people sensed the shift before understanding it. And Brian Whitaker turned his head slightly toward the direction of the sound, his posture still composed, but his eyes narrowing just enough to reveal calculation, as if trying to measure whether what was happening upstairs had anything to do with what had just happened down here. And the receptionist stood now, her chair sliding back with a soft scrape, her attention no longer divided, as she watched the stairwell entrance, as if expecting someone to come running through it. And for a moment nothing did, and then footsteps approached, not rushed, not panicked, but fast enough to break the rhythm of routine, and a nurse appeared at the top of the staircase, speaking into her radio in a low, urgent tone. Her words clipped, precise, stabilizing now. "Oxygen levels were dropping. We caught it just in time." And she did not look at anyone in the lobby as she passed, only moving forward with purpose toward the supply corridor. And that was when the space changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because the timing settled into place, like a missing piece clicking into alignment, and Brian felt it before he acknowledged it, the way the sequence lined up too perfectly to ignore the warning, the dismissal, the removal, and then the exact problem described unfolding upstairs within seconds. And he inhaled slowly, his hand adjusting his sleeve again, but this time the motion lacked its earlier confidence, as if the gesture itself could not quite reset what had already been disrupted. And one of the security guards near the entrance shifted his weight, glancing briefly through the glass doors toward Elijah, who still stood outside, unmoving, the rain now heavier, streaking down the surface in uneven lines. distorting his outline into something almost abstract, and the guard looked back at Brian, uncertain, not questioning aloud, but no longer fully certain of the role he had been given, and upstairs the noise began to settle. The alarm tones softening into intermittent beeps, the kind that signaled control being reestablished, and the resident doctor exhaled, quietly speaking to the team with a steadiness that returned structure to the moment. "Keep monitoring, we got ahead of it." And that phrase echoed in the mind of the nurse who had first noticed the shift, because she knew exactly how narrow that margin had been, how easily it could have gone the other way if they had waited even a minute longer. And downstairs the receptionist moved closer to the front desk again, her eyes no longer drifting, but fixed now on the entrance, as if seeing Elijah differently, not as an interruption, but as a question she had not known she needed to ask. And Brian finally stepped forward toward the doors, not quickly, not impulsively, but with a deliberate pace that carried both authority and something else, something less defined, something closer to doubt. And he stopped a few feet from the glass, watching the rain for a second before focusing on the figure beyond it. And for the first time since Elijah had entered the building, Brian did not speak immediately. He simply looked, as if searching for something he had missed earlier, something that had been present all along, but dismissed too quickly. And outside, Elijah remained still, his shoulders slightly damp, his face calm, his eyes no longer scanning for urgency, but resting in a quiet awareness that suggested the moment had already passed, and the outcome had already been decided, long before anyone else recognized it. And behind Brian, the lobby stayed silent, not because it was ordered to be, but because no one wanted to interrupt whatever realization was forming in that space between inside and outside, where control and truth had just briefly crossed paths, and neither had fully won. For a few seconds no one moved, not because they were told to stay still, but because something unspoken held them in place, like a shift in gravity that no one could explain. And Brian Whitaker stood facing the glass, his reflection faint against the rain-streaked surface, his own image slightly distorted, as if even the building refused to present him clearly in that moment. And behind him the receptionist swallowed quietly, her fingers resting on the edge of the desk, no longer pretending to be busy, while one of the security guards glanced again between Brian and Elijah, unsure now which direction authority was supposed to flow. And outside, Elijah Cross did not step closer, did not gesture, did not demand to be let back in. He simply stood there, the rain collecting along the shoulders of his coat, then slipping away in thin lines, as if even the weather moved around him with a kind of quiet respect. And Brian finally spoke, not loudly, not with command, but with a tone that lacked the certainty it had carried before. "You said room 214. And the words felt different now, not a challenge, not a dismissal, but a question that arrived too late to change what had already happened. And Elijah gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not proud, just an acknowledgement, as if confirming something that had never been uncertain in his mind. And Brian hesitated, not visibly to the others, but enough that the guard nearest to him shifted again, waiting for instruction that did not come. And upstairs the resident doctor stepped out into the hallway, pulling off his gloves as he spoke to a passing nurse, who flagged that room first. And she paused, just briefly searching her memory before answering. "Front desk called it in." And that answer traveled faster than footsteps, faster than elevators, faster than any formal report, because within moments it reached the charge nurse, then the administrative office, and then the director's floor, where quiet efficiency normally filtered everything before it became important. And this time it did not filter, it moved directly forward, because the timing did not make sense. And in places built on protocol, anything that did not follow expected sequence demanded attention. And downstairs Brian exhaled slowly, his eyes still fixed on Elijah, but now searching deeper, not just for explanation, but for context. And the space between them felt narrower, even with the glass still separating inside from outside, because what had just happened had already crossed that boundary in a way neither of them could undo. And the receptionist finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. They said the oxygen levels were dropping. And Brian did not respond immediately, because that detail settled into him differently than everything else. It was not dramatic, not visible, not something anyone in the lobby could have seen, and yet it had been named precisely before it happened. And that precision did not belong to guesswork, it belonged to knowledge. And Brian felt that realization land not as a shock, but as a quiet collapse of the assumptions he had built within seconds of seeing Elijah walk through the door. And the guard near the entrance reached for the panel beside the glass, not opening it, yet just resting his hand there waiting for a signal that had not been given, and Brian's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the effort of recalibrating something internal, something that had already shifted beyond simple correction. And outside, Elijah remained still, his eyes meeting Brian's now, without challenge, without expectation, just present, in a way that made silence feel heavier than words. And for the first time since the moment began, Brian did not look like a man controlling a situation. He looked like someone standing at the edge of understanding something he had almost ignored, and the rain continued to fall, steady, consistent, unbothered by the decisions being made on either side of the glass, while inside the hospital held its breath again, not in tension this time, but in anticipation of what would happen next when authority and truth finally stood in the same place without anything left to separate them. The moment stretched longer than it should have, not because anyone was forcing it to, but because no one knew how to move past it without acknowledging what had already been set in motion, and Brian Whitaker felt that weight settle into his chest in a way that no training manual had prepared him for. Because this was not a disruption he could correct with policy or procedure. This was something quieter, something that demanded recognition before resolution, and his hand lifted slightly, then lowered again, as if even the simple act of signaling the door had become more complicated than it should be, and behind him the receptionist remained still, her breathing shallow, not out of fear but out of awareness, as if she understood she had just crossed an invisible line between following instruction and following instinct. And upstairs the steady rhythm of recovery continued, monitors stabilizing, voices lowering, returning to routine, but with an undercurrent that had not been there before, because every person in that hallway knew how close the margin had been and how unusual it was for that kind of warning to arrive. From outside the system and back in the lobby, the rain softened slightly, its steady pattern easing into a quieter rhythm that tapped against the glass like a reminder rather than a demand. And Elijah Cross stood in that softened sound, unmoving, his presence no longer urgent, no longer pressing, just there, as if he had already stepped out of the moment, even while standing inside it. And Brian finally spoke again, his voice lower, now less defined by authority and more by something searching. "How did you know?" And the question did not travel far, it did not need to. It existed in the space between them where the answer already seemed to live, and Elijah did not respond immediately. He let the silence hold for a second longer, not to create tension, but because the answer was not something that could be reduced to a single explanation, and when he did speak, his tone carried no edge, no correction, just clarity. "Because I have seen it before." And that was all, no elaboration, no detail, just a statement that implied experience without demanding recognition, and Brian's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in concentration, as if trying to place that sentence into a framework that made sense, and failing, because the man in front of him did not fit any category he was used to managing. And the guard by the door shifted again, his hand still resting near the control panel, now waiting not for an order, but for permission that had not yet been given. And the receptionist glanced at Brian, then back at Elijah, her expression no longer uncertain, but thoughtful, as if she had already moved past doubt into quiet acceptance of something she could not fully explain. And upstairs the resident doctor stepped into the administrative corridor, his voice steady as he spoke to the first available supervisor. "We need to review monitoring assignments for that room. Something was off before the alert." And that sentence moved quickly because it carried implication not just of a near miss, but of a gap in attention. And in places like this, gaps mattered more than outcomes. And downstairs Brian felt that ripple before he heard it, the sense that the situation was no longer contained to a single moment, but expanding outward into systems, processes, accountability. And he looked again at Elijah, this time without the barrier of dismissal, without the immediate instinct to categorize. And for the first time there was space in his expression for something closer to recognition, not of identity, not yet, but of significance. And the rain outside continued its quieter rhythm, and Elijah's posture remained unchanged, his presence calm, steady, unforced, as if he had nothing to prove and nothing to reclaim. And in that stillness something shifted again, not loud, not visible, but certain. Because the balance between who held authority and who held truth had already begun to realign, and everyone in that lobby could feel it, even if no one had spoken it out loud. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that did not belong to urgency, yet carried it anyway, and footsteps followed, measured but direct, cutting through the quiet tension that had settled across the lobby. and every head turned not because they were told to, but because something in the movement demanded attention, and Charles Whitmore stepped forward from the hallway, his presence not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself because it was already recognized. And Brian Whitaker straightened instinctively, his posture aligning with protocol, his voice preparing to explain before a question had even been asked, but the words did not come because Charles did not look at him, not at first. His gaze moved past the front desk, past the polished floor, past the carefully maintained order of the room, and settled instead on the glass doors where the rain traced slow lines across the surface, and beyond it Elijah Cross stood still, unchanged, untouched by the shift inside, as if time had moved around him without altering anything at all. And Charles slowed, just slightly, not stopping, not hesitating, but adjusting in a way that only those who knew him well would notice, as if something familiar had entered his field of vision in a place it should not have been. And Brian spoke, then his tone controlled, but carrying a thread of urgency. "Sir, there was an incident, but it has been handled." And Charles lifted a hand, not sharply, not dismissively, just enough to pause the explanation before it formed fully, because whatever Brian believed he was about to clarify no longer held priority, and the lobby fell quieter, not silent, but attentive, as if waiting for something that had not yet been named. And Charles took another step closer to the doors, his reflection merging briefly with the rain streaks before his eyes focused fully beyond the glass. And for a fraction of a second his expression did not change, not visibly, not in a way anyone could immediately interpret, but something behind it shifted, something internal, something that did not belong to routine recognition, but to memory. And the guard nearest the entrance felt it without understanding it, his hand still resting near the control panel, now uncertain whether to act or remain still. And the receptionist held her breath, not out of fear, but because the moment felt too precise to interrupt. And Brian watched closely, now his confidence no longer steady, his mind trying to map this reaction to a structure that made sense, and failing because there was no precedent for what he was seeing. And outside, Elijah did not move, he did not step forward, he did not signal acknowledgement. He simply stood there, his gaze calm, meeting Charles without demand, without expectation, as if the recognition already existed independent of action. And the rain softened again, its rhythm easing into a quiet backdrop that made every small movement inside feel amplified. And Charles exhaled slowly, not heavily, not dramatically, just enough to release something that had tightened without warning. And his voice, when it came, was lower than usual, not uncertain, but altered in a way that shifted the entire space. "Open the door." And the words were simple, direct, but carried a weight that none of the staff had ever heard from him before. And the guard reacted immediately, pressing the panel. Without hesitation, the glass doors sliding open with that same soft mechanical sound. But this time, it did not feel routine, it felt like a threshold being crossed, and cool air moved into the lobby, carrying the scent of rain, and something else, something older, something less tangible. And Elijah took a single step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just aligned with the motion, as if this moment had already been decided long before it arrived. And Charles stepped closer, as well, the distance between them narrowing with each measured step until they stood within a few feet of each other, no longer separated by glass or assumption. And for a second neither spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the truth had already entered the room before words could follow. And Brian felt it fully, then not as confusion, but as realization, something fundamental shifting beneath his understanding of everything that had just happened. And Charles's eyes held Elijah's, steady, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried something that had not been present before, something unmistakable, something that did not belong to titles or positions, but to recognition itself. "Sir." The word did not echo loudly, yet it carried through the space with a weight that no one could ignore, not because of volume, but because of what it revealed. And Brian Whitaker felt it land before he understood it, the way a single shift in tone can rewrite everything that came before it. And Charles Whitmore stood still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on Elijah Cross, not searching anymore, not questioning, just recognizing. And in that stillness, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath, not out of suspense, but because something fundamental had just been confirmed without needing explanation. And Elijah did not react the way anyone expected. He did not stepped forward with pride. He did not speak to fill the silence. He simply inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed if not for the way Charles responded to it. And that was when the difference became undeniable, because the man who commanded the entire hospital, the man whose name sat on every official document, whose approval shaped every decision, lowered his voice even further, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect. "We thought you were gone." And the sentence settled into the room like something long unspoken finally given form, and Brian's chest tightened, not from pressure, but from realization, because whatever this connection was, it did not belong to coincidence. It belonged to history, to something deeper than titles and appearances, and the receptionist felt it too, her eyes widening slightly as she looked between them, trying to reconcile the man who had been dismissed moments ago with the way he was now being addressed. And the guard stepped back, instinctively, not ordered, not instructed, just moving in response to a shift in authority that had already redefined itself without announcement, and Elijah's voice came. Then calm, steady, carrying no trace of resentment, no need to reclaim anything. "I did not come back for recognition." And the simplicity of it cut through any expectation of confrontation, any anticipation of accusation, leaving only clarity in its place. And Charles nodded slowly, not surprised, not defensive, just accepting the truth of that statement, as if it aligned with something he already knew. And for a brief moment neither of them spoke again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence itself carried meaning enough. And Brian felt that silence more sharply than anyone else, because within it every decision he had made in the last few minutes replayed not as actions, but as assumptions built too quickly based on what he saw rather than what was real. And his hands lowered slightly at his sides, his posture no longer held by certainty, but by something closer to awareness. And upstairs the hallway had returned to its quiet rhythm, monitors, steady voices, low, the near miss, already transitioning into documentation, into review, into process. But down here the impact had not settled, it had expanded, because the meaning of what had just occurred could not be contained within a single room or a single moment. And Charles finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the others in the lobby, not addressing them directly, but making it clear that what was happening was not hidden, it was not private, it was part of the truth now visible to anyone willing to see it. And then his gaze returned to Elijah, and his voice carried a different tone this time, not just respect, but invitation. "Please come inside." And the words did not carry authority in the way commands usually did, they carried something else. Something earned, something offered. And Elijah stepped forward across the threshold, not with hesitation, not with triumph, but with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning, as if the space itself had simply adjusted to meet him where he already stood. And Brian watched that step closely, because in it he saw something he had not recognized before, not status, not power, but a kind of quiet certainty that did not need validation. And as Elijah passed him, there was no pause, no acknowledgement, no correction, just movement forward. And that absence of reaction landed heavier than any words could have, because it left Brian alone with the understanding of what had already been done and what could not be undone, while the doors closed behind them and the rain continued outside, unchanged, indifferent to everything except the steady passage of time. The lobby did not return to normal, it only became quieter, not in sound, but in certainty, as if something invisible had been rearranged and could not be placed back the way it was before. And Elijah Cross walked forward beside Charles Whitmore, without hurry, without hesitation, his steps measured against the polished floor that once reflected him as an outsider, but now seemed to follow him differently, not with recognition, but with acceptance. And no one spoke, not the receptionist, not the guards, not the patients seated along the walls, because words would have felt smaller than what had just taken place. And Brian Whitaker remained where he stood, his hands at his sides, his posture no longer structured by control, but by stillness, the kind that comes when understanding arrives without permission. And he watched as Elijah moved past him, not looking back, not slowing down, not offering judgment or acknowledgement, just continuing forward, as if the moment behind him had already dissolved into something finished. And that absence of reaction stayed with Brian heavier than any confrontation could have, because it left no room for defense, no space for explanation, only reflection. And Charles slowed slightly as they reached the center of the lobby, not stopping, but adjusting his pace just enough to align with Elijah, as if the path forward required them to. walked side by side rather than one leading the other, and his voice, when it came again, was quiet, not for secrecy, but for respect. "We tried to reach you." And Elijah's eyes moved briefly across the space, not searching, not avoiding, just taking in what had changed, and what had remained the same, and he answered simply, "I know." And that was all, no accusation, no elaboration, just acknowledgement, and Charles nodded once, as if that answer confirmed more than it revealed, and around them the hospital continued, its rhythm, monitors beeping softly, footsteps echoing faintly through distant corridors, the steady movement of a place designed to operate without interruption. Yet beneath that rhythm something new had settled, something quieter, something that could not be documented or filed, but could be felt in the way people now looked at Elijah, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with a kind of recognition they did not fully understand. And Brian finally moved, not forward, not backward, just a single step that broke the stillness he had been holding, and his gaze followed Elijah, not with authority, not with control, but with awareness. And in that awareness something shifted, not externally and not visibly, but internally, in a way that would remain long after the moment passed. And the receptionist returned slowly to her position, her hands resting on the desk, not to resume routine, but to steady herself, as if she too understood that something had changed in the way she would see the people who walked through those doors from now on. And the guard near the entrance lowered his hand from the control panel, no longer waiting for instruction, because the moment that required it had already moved beyond him. And outside, the rain continued its steady fall, soft now, almost distant, as if the storm had already done what it came to do. And inside, Elijah paused, just once, not turning, not stopping fully, just enough to let the space settle around him, before continuing forward. And in that pause the entire lobby seemed to exhale, not loudly, not collectively, but in the quiet way that follows understanding when it arrives without warning. And Charles remained beside him, his presence no longer defined by position but by recognition, and together they moved toward the inner corridors, where the light shifted slightly warmer, where the sounds softened further, where the work of the hospital continued beyond the reach of the front doors. And Brian stood alone in that space for a moment longer, not abandoned, not exposed, just present with the realization of what had happened and what it meant. And he did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that would change it. And as the automatic doors behind him opened and closed again, letting in another wave of quiet rain air, the reflection on the polished floor no longer showed just a manager maintaining order. It showed a man standing at the edge of something deeper, something he had only just begun to understand, while ahead Elijah Cross walked forward, not as someone returning to claim anything, but as someone who had never needed to.